Welcome back to the news today. Our debate tonight, is it payback time for V15? The Israeli political group which campaigned against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in last year's elections now finds itself in the sight of new legislation aimed to curb activities of groups like it. It's believed that V15 received tens of millions of dollars to fund its campaign to unseat Netanyahu, but since it did not explicitly back a specific party or candidate, it did not have to comply with Israel's strict laws on campaign finance and propaganda. The move has already sparked a backlash, with critics saying it infringes on free speech and political association. With us tonight to debate the issue are Polly Bronstein, CEO of V15. Good evening.
Good evening.
And I24News senior analyst Emmanuel Navon, professor of international relations at Tel Aviv University. Good evening, Professor Navon. Well, Polly, maybe let's begin by breaking down this proposed new legislation. It says that organizations like V15 must comply with laws and regulations that usually are assigned to parties, political parties in Israel, and that V15 was able to do this because of a loophole in the law, and now they're trying to mend this loophole. It begs the question, so is this really a problem?
First of all, I need to take this opportunity to say that V15 no longer exists. V15 was an ad hoc campaign for the last election in 2015, and since then emerged a new movement called Darkenu. Darkenu is a merge between V15 and One Voice. This is a movement that is pushing back very hard on extremism, trying to build a moderate camp of Israelis. We believe that both right and left side in Israel has a big moderate majority in it, and we are trying to promote its core values. After saying that, I need to tell you that this law, what it's trying to do, is very undemocratic, because parties in Israel get funded by the government, by the taxpayers' money. And charities from the right wing and organizations from the right wing also get money from the government. But organizations like ours that have a different opinion, that want to push back on the government's policy, don't have any funding from nowhere. Our only chance to raise our voice, and our voice represents hundreds of thousands of Israelis, is by asking people to donate money to us. And by the way, since this law was announced yesterday, or it's going to be tried to be promoted in the Knesset, a lot of people, hundreds of Israelis, went into our website and started donating to us once more, which is, it's brilliant. It shows that Israelis want to take part in the public sphere and raise their voice.
So this is an interesting boomerang effect of this new legislation, that people are donating more. Professor Navon, Polly Bronstein is raising a point here that we need to address. She's saying that this is really infringing in some way on free speech in Israel, that an organization can, if it wants to, try to unseat a prime minister.
Well, I agree with that. There should be absolute freedom of speech for not only citizens but also non-governmental organizations, complete freedom to raise money and, of course, to try and unseat a sitting prime minister. There's no debate about this. This is self-evident. The real question is where do you set the limit between political activism, which falls under the law of political parties and their funding, and what is general freedom of speech? And that is the real issue. In other words, when a non-governmental organization is directly involved in a political campaign, which is in itself is completely legitimate, of course, let it be clear, whether it's from the right or from the left, that's irrelevant. And when it is actively involved in a political campaign during elections, why shouldn't the law of the funding of political parties not apply to it? And that is the question. As you know, this debate exists not only in Israel, but also, of course, in other democracies, in the United States, for example. And there were many decisions of the Supreme Court regarding non-governmental organizations or private organizations that pour millions of dollars in for candidates, but it's not directly funding them or the political parties. It's just promoting their agenda. And so the question is, what is the point of having those very strict laws on the funding of political parties and candidates if you can bypass them with non-governmental organizations? And again, it doesn't matter if they're from the right or from the left. There should be complete freedom of speech and of fundraising. But I think that NGOs that are completely political should just say it and should not hide anything. And I think we need clarity and we need complete transparency.
Where do you draw the line between political activism and free speech? Because it does seem like it would be problematic that a campaign like this is acting within an election campaign, and this is what the legislation is really using. It's saying this is during an election campaign, you need to comply with the laws that every party must comply with during the campaign. Where is that line drawn?
So again, I want to emphasize so everyone has a clear understanding. The parties can have laws about how much money they can raise, but on top of that, they are getting millions of shekels from the government to run campaigns. Organizations like ours can't run their campaigns from the backyard of their, their neighbors. They need money to run serious campaigns. This is part of freedom of speech, and the only way we can raise money like that is by getting donations. But at the same time, you asked about where the line goes. I want to say there's no loophole. There's just a law. The law exists, and we complied with the law. We were very, very strict back at the time we ran V15 to comply with the law and make sure that we're not doing anything illegal. I don't think there's a loop in the whole. And by the way, this needs to be said. When Netanyahu, it was comfortable for him, he used the same law to do the same thing. Back in '96, he ran a very serious campaign, not on his behalf, but with a charity ran by billions of dollars coming from a Haredi billionaire, and he won the elections by doing that. So you know what? If that's the law, everyone can enjoy the freedom of speech that it allows non-partisan organizations. And I think this is very clear. It's a trend in Israeli Knesset today from the coalition to try and silence everyone who has criticism or has another opinion. The truth is there are many Israelis, I would say a majority of Israelis, that are very unhappy with the policies of Netanyahu and this government, and they need to be able to raise money to raise a serious voice, a significant voice in Israel. That's democracy.
So that brings to the fore what Netanyahu could be concerned with, or the Likud party could be concerned with, because on the face of it, it seems like he shouldn't be concerned with V15. He's still the prime minister. He was elected again. So why does this legislation come now? It seems like this shouldn't worry him. After all, he was re-elected as prime minister.
Well, we have to understand, and I agree that having non-governmental organizations and, of course, the ability to criticize the government is part of democracy, but so are elections. In other words, the current government was elected, and that's also part of democracy. Both are part of democracy. And I do think that all these organizations, as I said, should have the freedom to raise money and to act, to promote their agenda. But when it comes, it doesn't matter if they're from the right or from the left. As I said before, when you're directly involved, and you mentioned the non-governmental organization that Netanyahu used in 1996, but so did, of course, Ehud Barak from the Labour Party in 1999. Everybody does it. But that's the problem. That's exactly the problem. Maybe, I mean, you said there's no loophole, but maybe the law should be changed in order to make things more clear. In other words, if you're going to use all these non-governmental organizations to run your campaign legally because you're not actually raising money from your own party, but you're doing it via non-government organizations, all I'm saying is that the voters should be aware of it. And I think that what we have to do here is maybe change the law, not in order to try and silence organizations, but in order to make sure that all the political organizations, all the political NGOs, whether they're from the right, from the left, or from the center, just expose their game. Say if they are in the politics business, they should say it, and the citizens should know it, and they should be free to donate money to those organizations, to militate in those organizations, but they should know what their agenda is and that they are about politics. That's it.
Can I just add, you talked about the public being aware and about being, I absolutely agree with you. What about a newspaper in Israel that most of the public is not aware? It's the largest newspaper in Israel. It's being funded by hundreds of billions of dollars, millions of dollars every year by a billionaire from the United States with his own political and economical interests, practically running Israel. And are the readers aware that they're reading a Pravda, a newspaper that is promoting Netanyahu? And by the way, in the last days before the elections, the few months before the elections, they poured hundreds of millions of dollars into increasing their publicity of this specific newspaper. If that's not money coming from abroad interfering with Israeli elections, then I don't know what is money from abroad interfering with elections. So
it is, but we still have to make the difference between newspapers and NGOs. And as you know, it is true for other newspapers also in Israel. The main rival of Israel Hayom, the newspaper you were mentioning, is Yediot Ahronot, which also has an agenda which is against Israel Hayom. And therefore, newspapers, of course, have their agendas. Many are owned by people with their own agenda and interests. And that is part of the political activism. But I think we also have to draw a line between newspapers and media on the one hand and non-governmental organizations on the other hand.
But let's not have double standard regarding money that is coming from abroad.
I agree with you. There should be absolutely no double standards, but there should be transparency.
And I just want to add, Dalkenu is using private money of donors from the United States and the UK, all Zionists and Jewish and caring about Israel, but also a lot of micro donations coming from the hundreds of thousands of supporters that Dalkenu has. And I think if that's not democracy, people taking ownership of this kind of a grassroots movement, then I don't know what a grassroots movement is.
And even though you say V15 is no longer in existence, do you feel that now with this new legislation, maybe V15 did work? If the Likud party is worried about organizations like this, maybe in some way it did its share.
We find it inspiring, the fact that Netanyahu and the Likud are still obsessed with V15, still panicking. And also I want to tell you, I find it very bizarre that when we have threats like ISIS, threats like tunnels from the Hamas and missiles and people and a knife intifada, the Prime Minister is worried about and concerned about the citizens of Israel and in a movement like ours and fights the citizens of Israel instead of fighting the real threats around us. We find it very concerning.
Fighting the citizens of Israel instead of fighting threats around us. Quite a dramatic statement.
Yes, I think it's a bit overstated. I wouldn't call this fighting the citizens of Israel. I think I have my own concerns and criticism and reservation about this proposed bill, but I wouldn't call it fighting the citizens of Israel. I think this bill is unnecessary, but I don't think the government is fighting the citizens of Israel by promoting it.
I think we're seeing, as I said, a very concerning fashion now in Israel. It started with the comments the Prime Minister did against the Arab citizens of Israel during the last days before the election, and it continues with a lot of anti-democratic laws that we're seeing from the coalition. And I can tell you from our moderate camp side of things that every morning that we wake up and we see another attempt by the coalition to minimize democracy and put restraints on it, we're very, very concerned. We think that Netanyahu should be very concerned about the outer threats and not against the people that he finds inner threats. We are not an inner threat. We are citizens who love Israel and very, very concerned.
I did not call you an inner threat, and you're not an inner threat, but I don't think the government is fighting its own citizens either.
Well, Professor Navon, Polly, one of the points Polly made was about left and right, and this is a point you addressed as well, that this goes for both left and right organizations, but it does seem that there is a trend for laws like this to rise when it concerns the left-wing activity first, and then the Knesset or the parliament, the Israeli parliament, says, well, this applies to everyone. But it seems that what wakes up these legislations first is a left-wing activity.
Well, I think that regarding a previous bill that was proposed a couple or 3 months ago, it was regarding the funding of non-governmental organizations when most of the funding comes from governments. And here there's an issue that needs to be addressed. I mean, first of all, if you call yourself a non-government organization and most of your money, of your budget comes from government, there is a problem. But also, I think you know, a lot of people realize that a lot of those NGOs receive most of their money from governments with a very clear agenda, from European governments and from the European Commission. Some of those NGOs promote what the Palestinians call the right of return, which of course is incompatible with a two-state solution, actively take part in the BDS movement, and try to sue Israeli IDF soldiers and officers in international courts. And I think that what the law, I mean, I think what a lot of people are saying is that it is legitimate for European governments and from the European Commission to try and influence the Israeli government, but it should be done through the acceptable diplomatic channels, and they shouldn't hide their game by giving money to all these NGOs when most of the money comes from governments. They're not NGOs anymore. And so the previously proposed bill did not limit whatsoever the ability of those NGOs to act and to promote their agendas and to raise money. All they had to do was to disclose when more than 50% of the budget came from government, to just say it, so that people should know. I think this also has to do with clarity and transparency. As I said again, I'll say it, and I said before, and I'll say it again, I am against infringing upon the freedom of speech and the ability of those NGOs to act, but I'm in favor of complete transparency, and this applies also to all those NGOs funded by European governments.
Yeah, and I want to support what you just said, and we are totally in agreement that everyone should have all these cards on the table and everyone should know where the money is coming from. And in that sense, Darkenu or V15 had no governmental money, and all of its money came from private donors.
And you just raised more money thanks to the government.
Absolutely.
And it also, V15 did not have anything to do with BDS or any of that. I just want to make it clear. Thank you both, Emmanuel Navon and Polly Bronstein, for joining me tonight. The news today is